This Russian-Ukraine war situation is making a turn, to my mind, in a bad direction, and that's the Western countries are on the ante by supplying the Ukrainians with even heavier armaments, in this case battle tanks. I'll go through it, and it's disappointing because I don't think it's going to have a good outcome. The papers have been, to my mind, universally jingoistic and raw, sort of like cheerleading and back in Ukraine without fully looking at the situation and the ramifications. They've simplified it down to a good versus evil. Ukraine's good, it's David, and Russia's bad, and it's Goliath. There's no acceptance of any input, anything that the West could have, should have, maybe done to try and resolve the disagreements that Russia had with Ukraine vis-a-vis the people in the border areas that Russia felt were being discriminated, persecuted by Ukraine. No mention of the Minsk agreement, no acceptance of any responsibility. NATO pushing further eastward. At some point, you push people into a corner, you'll get a reaction. It's like the old rat catcher. Never push a rat into a corner. Always give the rat a means of escape so that you don't have to end up going toe to toe. They pushed the Russians into a corner, and they thought that they could just keep pushing them and that the Russians would accept it. Now you've got to put this into context, as though these tanks are going to make a fundamental difference. We've been told over the last X months that old plucky Ukraine is punching way above its weight, and it's landing jabs on the nose of the Russian bear, and it's pushing the Russians back. You also have the Zelensky, who is the president of Ukraine, constantly requesting more and more assistance, as you would expect. He's pushed and pushed for tanks, and it looks like the Germans are relenting. The Brits, as stupid as ever, to get into foreign wars when domestic issues are the main concern of the people. But here, presto, let's just shove all of that nonsense like food banks, people living on the streets, cost of living, pension crises, high taxes, immigration out of control, illegal immigration out of control, NHS in crisis, in the gutter, not functioning. Pick any of the terms that you want. education, problems, strikes. But hey, oh no, let's send some tanks to gift them, of course, to Ukraine, along with the rest of the gifts that were given. No real push for peace. No push to try and resolve it. Just this insistence that Ukraine, sovereign Ukraine, has to get back all of the territory that the nasty Ruskies have taken off them. How many people are getting killed on both sides is unclear. Reports come through and I don't follow it intently, so I've got no real idea whether the numbers are correct or not, but it's got to be in the tens of thousands. Millions of people from Ukraine spread all over Europe. There's a cost involved, a human cost, and there's a physical cost. Here of banks and countries talking about rebuilding Ukraine and the money that will be able to be released and available for that. And you go, what are these people trying to do? I never hear the push for peace. Never hear it. None of the articles talk about peace. All of the articles just talk about is war, war, war. Let's get more battle tanks. If we get more battle tanks, then we'll be able to beat the Russians and push them all the way back to Russia. You'll probably have some people say, well, why stop at Russia? Why stop at the border? Let's go all the way to Moscow. Let's get this thing resolved once and for all. And you go, but anyway, the Germans seem to have buckled, bent, changed their minds. And the Germans were saying that they weren't prepared to send battle tanks to Ukraine or allow countries that they had sold their tanks to. In this case, the tanks are called Leopard tanks. They're not Panzers, they're Leopard tanks. To Ukraine, these are the countries, places like, I believe, Poland, primarily Finland, Sweden, kind of want to gift, lend, lease, whatever. I think it's gift of these tanks to Ukraine on the basis that if we don't help the Ukrainians out, a few days, few weeks, few months, few years later, the Ruskies will be knocking on our door, and we might as well fight them in Ukraine as fight them when they come into Poland. I can't grasp that. It is like an argument basis. I just can't. In the time that Russia had control over the Eastern blocs, it became apparent even to the Russians that they couldn't keep a control of all of the satellite countries. You know, they had, I think was it 56 or something in Hungary, and then you had Prague, wherever it was, 68, around about that time. That's 40 odd years ago. World's moved on. At that time, it was the USSR. The USSR fragmented, split up. It's been Russia since the late 90s. It hasn't made any aggressive moves apart from bits of ex-Russia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, stuff like that. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't made any territorial claims on places like Poland. Anyway, the Germans use the you do this, then we'll do this. You go first. Basically saying for the United States to send some big tanks across there. If you do that, then we'll send some of our Leopards and allow the other countries to send their Leopards to Ukraine. Okay. Well, everybody, it's just like social media. The rest of the gang have got together and they've decided to Twitter blitz the Germans and say your buddies should be ashamed of yourself, and all the rest of the sort of psychological tricks that people get up to. And Germany seems to be relented and said, okay. The United States used the argument fence that the Abrams tanks, not to work on gas turbines and either to use aviation fuel or some magical compound you don't have across there. Oh, they use loads and loads of gallons. Think of the global warming if we give them these tanks. And they need a load of maintenance, and there's people that do this are so specialized and stuff like that. It's even more complicated than the Tesla car. Come on, man. We'll give you this other stuff, rockets and mortars and howitzers and guns, and stuff like that. We'll give you loads of that, but the tanks, not too sure. The tide seems to be turning on the Americans, and you just go, this is just like watching a war, like the First World War, if you go through the stages and the steps of how it happened. Just step by step, blindly walking down, never thinking of the end outcome, the end game. How is this supposed to end? On the West, you've got it's supposed to end by sovereign Ukraine being totally free of them nasty Ruskies, and get them out of Crimea as well. You can argue about the referendums, but I would think that an unbiased person would tend to think that the bulk of the people in Crimea are Russian extraction, speak Russian. The likelihood is that if you do have a UN referendum, that they'll want to stay with Russia. So how do you go about that? You can argue that it was part of Ukraine. You can argue the counter that it was actually part of Russia, and then Khrushchev or somebody gifted it to Ukraine. You can argue the bits, and you can argue the borders in Europe for the last 1,000 years have been malleable and moved and stuff like that. How about the Germans arguing about the border with Poland? that got arbitrarily moved at the end of the Second World War. What about the colonies that arbitrarily got moved from one country to another at the end of the First World War? You can argue about all these borders. But if you say that the people that live in the place should have some sort of sovereignty, it's who has sovereignty over the land? Do the people that live there have sovereignty? Or is sovereignty imbibed in just the country, and the country cannot be fragmented? Well, what happens when a country wants to fragment? We've seen it in the last 50 years in Europe. Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. We've seen it in what used to be Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Herzegovina, whatever the names of the places are. We've seen it in Germany, West Germany, East Germany, just Germany now. So countries are formed and split apart. Granted, the bulk of it's being done peaceably. The Russians argue one side, the Ukrainians will argue another. But the Western countries don't seem to be pushing for peace. They're not, they're just pushing for more aggression. Walk down the lines that could happen. Okay, so we'll give them, Brits will give them half a dozen or 14 tanks. The Germans will give them 14 tanks. Poland gives them, okay, so they get 100 or 200 tanks. If you believe the reports, the Russians have tanks in the thousands. That's not to say that the tanks can't make a difference. But normally tank warfare, and Ukraine's a great place for it, because cast your mind back to WW2 when the Panzers rolled across the border there. The big tank battles, places like Kursk and places like that. But what that showed you, that you've got to have an overwhelming force to make any real difference. Kursk was a battle between the Germans and the Russians. Huge, huge tank battle. I think it was 1942. 42 or 43. Huge battle. It's probably 43. Huge tank battle. Thousands of tanks on either side. It ended up with stalemate. The tanks used at the start of a war to bash your way through the lines and open stuff up. But this is like dug in positions now. Plus the fact that the munitions that you've got to put tanks out of operation now are far more effective than in World War II. But then again, the tanks they've got methods of stopping the infrared. They've got smoke grenades on them, and they've got blocking devices, and they've got new types of armor, reactive armor and stuff like that. But when you see these missiles being fired against them, they still blow the tanks up. So okay, let's follow down the one path that the Ukrainians get 100 to 200 tanks gifted to them. Okay, so the Russians have got 2,000. So the Russians have got 10 tanks. But the Russian tanks are all crap. You know, they're just like the tank equivalent of the Lauda. You know, they're knee good. We've captured some of the tanks, and they're just they haven't got the CD player in them. And I mean to say they've still got they've still just got a cassette in the tanks. You know, we've got the Bluetooth in, you know, you plug your iPhone. Okay, so maybe it's the tanks that are being gifted to Ukraine, super tanks, and they're going to knock all of these 2,000 Russian tanks out. And that this turns the tide of war, then they push the Ruskies out. Really? And the Russians are just going to accept when they've been pushed back to the border. And that's it. No plan for peace. Just we'll push them out, that's it. We'll join NATO, that's Ukraine, and we'll join the EU, and everything will be dory hunky. Let's look at it, and that it doesn't quite go to that plan. To get there, 50, 60, 100, wherever tanks. These tanks get used. Some of them get blasted, put out of action. In war situations, one of the things that you've got is that things break. Things need maintenance. If they get gifted these 100 tanks, it's unlikely that they'll have 100 tanks serviceable and usable at all times. And then you've got the normal breakdowns of the tanks. Then you're going to get someone getting blown up. People will die with it, unfortunately. It may marginally change the front line. So, okay, what happens in 6 months' time? You've had these 100 tanks. And basically, we're still at stalemate here. You'll have Zelensky, obviously, I would imagine, requesting more. Tanks were great. We just need more tanks. How about another 100 tanks? That's right. What we're doing is correct. We just haven't done it enough. We need to give them 200 tanks, 300, 400. We need to give them 1,000 tanks. What happens if the 1,000 tanks doesn't improve anything? And the Russians, they've got, depends where you read about it, they've got tanks by the thousands. Okay, a lot of them are old, a lot of them are crappy. But just say it makes a marginal difference in the push the Russians halfway back. How long do we go on in this situation with this continuous war? Well, yeah, these wars tend to peter out. Afghanistan. Was there fighting? Yeah, there was fighting all the time. It just wasn't on a big scale. Same in Iraq, Fallujah, and all these places. The big burst at the start, the air munitions, awe and shock and shock and awe and shock and then you come to policing, holding the ground. That's what the Russians found out in the states after the WW2. The cost of it is just phenomenal. What we're going to do, going to constantly give money to Ukraine instead of pushing for peace, get some sort of peace settlement that both sides will agree with. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians won't agree to the peace. They say, no, the land's ours and that's sacrosanct and we're not going to give it up. We'll fight to the death. And a lot of the Ukrainians will die because of it, and other people, and Russians. Sovereignty, what does it mean? It's just the papers, the media. There doesn't seem to be any acknowledgement. There doesn't seem to be any sort of balanced discussion where this will lead to. Just each time we've heard it from the Ukrainians, if you give with the guns, then this will turn it. If you give with this will do this. And yeah, you've ended up with stalemate. The Russians have got the land that they deem should be part of Russia. And they basically said, that's it. You've got the raw side from the Western papers, media. You know, this will be a hammer blow. We've got to beat the Russians. This is for the sake of, democracy. Come on, man. We all at primary school. Does anybody really believe that? What happens if this doesn't work? You spend all of these tanks, more tanks, and that doesn't work. You end up in a 2-year war, 3, 10, 5. Is that what the Americans realistically want? That we tie Russia up in this war forever and drain them so that they're not an economic power? The papers concentrate on the technicality. Oh, this tank and this, then it's got this, and blah, blah, blah. We'll send so many in this. You've got Yermak. He's a Ukrainian, part of their government. A few hundred tanks for our tank crews. The best tank crews in the world. Raw, 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 raw. And this is going to become a real punching fist of democracy against the autocracy from the bog. It's something that you might say to the actual tank crews as you're giving them their keys. But I don't hear any diplomacy. I don't hear anybody pushing for peace. I don't hear anybody even talking about peace. Is all of this worth it? Is all of this effort, lives worth this bits of land? I'm unsure. I'm unsure. Big problems at home. Yep, I had Boris, racing out there to glad hand Yelensky. You had Sunak, the Prime Minister, current Prime Minister, saying, yeah, he agrees with him and get yourself out there. And, Britain is a friend to Ukraine. Okay, fine. Really? Why are we right at the front of the queue giving people tanks? Is there not a better way that we could push for peace than this? Big problems at home. Let's divert people's attention. Let's have a bit of a war. Oh, my goodness. They talk about the tanks and it reminds me of like when you see the pictures of the First World War with the raw, sign up and join the army, wave the flags and all that sort of stuff. Well, a lot of people don't realise that conscription in the British Army in the first years of the war was voluntary. can be conscription and voluntary, but joining up for them was voluntary. A lot of people didn't want to join up, didn't want to go fight. They had to enforce conscription, had to be legislated and mandated. You actually had people going around trying to cajole people to join the army and stuff like that. Go and read about it. And I think the same is today. I think the papers have got this totally wrong. I think there's a huge, but can't prove it, can I? Just people I speak to. There's a huge body of people in the UK who don't want to get involved in any more conflicts. They don't want to propagate any more wars. The papers never mention peace. The politicians never mention peace. It's just accepted that this, the only way to resolve it is by force and by forcing the Ruskies out. I don't think it's a good way to go. Just like in the First World War, I think there's a huge body of people that didn't want anything to do with the First World War, didn't want to sign up for the army, didn't want anything to do with it. There's plenty of money to be made. There's plenty of money to be made out of munitions, plenty of money to be made, plenty of money to be made. Gas contracts, buy it from the US, plenty of money to be made, plenty of money to make. I've cut the Ruskies out of selling all that cheap gas. There's plenty of money to be made. Follow the money. Follow the money, see where that leads. Democracy. Come on, man. Primary school stuff. Spondomics. Money. Rebuilding Ukraine. Money, money, money. All the munitions. Pay more money for American gas. Build some more terminals. Push for peace. Maybe as if the people spent as much time trying to bring some sort of peace settlement, things would be a lot better. I was wrong on, I didn't think that the Russians would invade Ukraine. Personally, I don't think they'll push past the areas where they're at now to any great extent. My personal view, I think the Russians they'll accept the land that they've got now if you took it to a peace settlement. People will say, oh yeah, but they'll just do that. Then next year they'll want to invade and nibble a little bit more and a little bit. I don't think so, just personally. I think it's worth giving that a shot rather than continuing this war to that extent. It's affected millions of people. Tens of thousands of people are dead. People have been named for life. People's jobs, land, futures terminated, ruined because of it. When we get the promises is just, we'll kick the Russians out. You know, we'll get every scrap of square centimetre of Ukraine back. You know, we won't rest till ultimate victory. I think the politicians are looking at a different reality. I don't think it's good. I think these tanks will just escalate the problem. I don't think they'll resolve anything long-term by it. Will they push the Russians back to the border? I don't truly believe that. You've got hanging over this the mushroom cloud. It's, you're not dealing with a third world, third-rate country. Well, you're dealing with some country that's got nuclear weapons. What happens if you push them too far? Once you let the tactical nukes out of the tin, some hope of getting things back to normal. The downside risks that you're looking at by expanding and elevating this versus the possible gains just seem to be, people say, oh, you're just a Russian bot, you just putting Putin's playthings. I just think it's probably, I never hear anybody talking about peace. Hear them talking about tanks, increasing weapons. I hear them being belligerent. I never hear them talking about pushing for peace. No. These are just the enemy. We've got to fight them to the Ukrainian people's deaths. Because that's, in essence, that's what it is. It's NATO and the Americans basically funneling arms, munitions, aid, assistance, militarily, monetarily, sanctions. Huge cost. All those Western companies that have lost money by pulling out of Russia, huge cost. The sanctions, huge cost. Lots of countries in the world have said, yeah, we aren't going to go with them sanctions. If you want to put the sanctions on, that's up to you. We ain't going to put the sanctions on. Is this just a, like a proxy war, Russia, America? Some people say so. People in Ukraine are the ones that's having to pay the price. Like John Lennon said, give peace a chance. I haven't seen any of that in the papers, on the TV. I just see a one-sided. Yesterday, there was a load of people from Ukraine got bladdered by Zelensky for corruption. Is that part of the deal? You need to bladder all these people because we know they're corrupt before we give you the tanks. Is that part of it? Is the EU corrupt? Yeah, of course it is. You've had all of them people with their fingers in the pot. Is the UK corrupt? There's gas inflammable. Is America corrupt? The different types of corruption. Take the UK for corruption. Oh, well, go through what's happened in the last couple of years. Try and say it with a straight face that, you know, the UK is not corrupt. It's an upside down society. Anyway, we're getting off topic here. I'm Tim.